She wasn't supposed to survive the storm. Not out there. Not in that cold. But when retired Marine Sergeant Frank Morrison opened the door to his remote Montana cabin and saw 3 wild horses collapsed on his porch, steaming, silent, and nearly frozen to death, he knew this wasn't a coincidence. They hadn't wandered. They had come with purpose. And something about the way the lead mare looked at him. It felt like a message, a plea, or maybe a warning. The storm had a name, the kind they only used when things got bad. Bomb cyclone. For 3 relentless days, it clawed across the mountains with hurricane-force winds and snow, so heavy it erased everything. Frank's cabin, tucked deep in the pines, sat like a matchbox in the middle of a white hell. But he didn't mind the isolation. He preferred it. At 62, Frank had traded crowds and noise for silence and wood smoke, for long nights with his fire and a battered copy of Hemingway, a decorated veteran with 3 tours in Afghanistan behind him. Frank wasn't afraid of nature. What haunted him was memory. He'd prepared for this kind of storm. The fireplace roared. Supplies were stacked. The power had gone out, but he barely noticed. That night, just after midnight, he was reading when he heard it. Faint, unnatural, nearly drowned by the wind. A soft, broken whinny. He froze, listened. Nothing. He waited, convinced it was his imagination. His therapist had warned him. Storms could play tricks on the mind. But then it came again. Clearer this time. Closer. Frank stood, crossed the room, pulled back the curtain. Through the frosted glass, visibility was down to inches. But something shifted. Movement near the porch. Then, a heavy thud. Then another. He grabbed his flashlight and cracked open the door. The storm hit him like a wave of knives. He aimed the beam downward. 3 horses. They lay collapsed in the snow, their bodies steaming in the frigid air, coats matted with ice. Their sides moved, barely. One of them, a chestnut mare with a white blaze, tried to lift her head. Her dark eyes locked onto Frank's, and that's when he knew. This wasn't random. These horses were dying. And somehow, in their final hour they'd found him. By the way, let us know in the comments, what country are you watching from, and what time is it right now? It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Frank stepped closer, heart pounding. The mare didn't flinch. In fact, she turned, looking over her shoulder, back into the storm. Again and again. Something out there had her attention, something she couldn't leave behind. The second horse, a gray mare, didn't stir. Frost clung to her eyelashes. Her lips were blue. The third, a young bay colt, trembled so violently he couldn't stand. All 3 were in critical shape, hypothermic, exhausted, and barely clinging to life. Frank's training kicked in. These were wild animals. Even dying, they could be dangerous. But that look in the mare's eyes, it wasn't wild. It was something else. Something Frank had seen before, in the eyes of children pulled from rubble in Kandahar. Desperate trust. "You're my last hope," he whispered. "Okay, beautiful. Let's get you out of this cold." And with that, he made a decision no rational person would make. He dragged furniture aside, opened his cabin to the storm, and welcomed in the dying strangers at his door. But even as he worked, even as he brought the first mare inside and wrapped her in every blanket he owned, Frank couldn't shake what he'd seen. There had been something else in that snow. Small, moving, vulnerable. Something still out there. And whatever it was, those horses had been protecting it. Frank moved with urgency, but not panic. Every minute mattered. He'd spent enough time in combat zones to know the difference between fear and focus. The horses were in shock. Ice clung to their manes. Their breath was shallow. Too fast, and they'd go into cardiac arrest. Too slow, and hypothermia would win. He cranked the fireplace to its limits. Piled blankets, coats, even his sleeping bag over their trembling bodies. The chestnut mare, he started calling her Star, for the bright white blaze on her forehead, stayed alert, her eyes constantly shifting to the door. She wasn't resting. She was waiting for something or someone. The gray mare lay motionless. Frost crystals still sparkled on her eyelashes. Her lips almost gray from oxygen loss. Frank pulled her in on a makeshift sled, a dismantled coffee table wrapped in tarp. He started calling her Storm. The third, the colt, barely more than a foal, collapsed inside on his own, legs buckling beneath him. Bronze. The name just felt right. Shivered violently, his young body unable to generate enough heat to stabilize. Frank's cabin had become a triage unit. He kept talking to them, softly, steadily, the way he'd once spoken to young Marines when the firefight ended, and the blood was real. "You're okay now. I've got you. You made it." But Star wouldn't settle. She kept rising, even on weak legs, pacing toward the door, not in panic, not in fear, in urgency. Frank knew the look. He'd seen it in war zones, on mothers searching rubble for missing children. She wasn't done, she'd brought the others here, but she'd left something behind. Frank's breath caught in his throat as he remembered what he saw. That flicker behind them in the snow, small, fragile, moving, still out there. He dressed fast. Thermal layers, Arctic boots, rope, a hat pulled low. Before he opened the door, Star pushed against it, trying to follow. Frank placed a hand on her neck. "You stay warm. I'll find whoever's still out there." But Star didn't listen. She pushed past him. Weak, limping but focused. A mission burned in her eyes. Frank let her lead, into the storm. Visibility was nearly nothing. Just a flashlight beam and wind like razors. Star moved with purpose, nose to the ground, following the trail. Her hooves stumbled in drifts, but she kept going. Frank followed her through the trees, fighting each step, and then, he saw it. A white trailer, nearly invisible against the snow, overturned and crushed beside a stand of pine. Frank's heart dropped. He'd seen trailers like this in news reports, illegal transport rigs used in wild horse trafficking. No windows, no ventilation, no second chances. Star didn't pause. She moved past it, down a small slope. Frank followed. There, barely visible in the snow, was a shape. A tiny foal, maybe 3 months old, curled into herself like a dying ember. Silver-gray fur, black mane, ice clinging to her nostrils. Still, Star moved to her and nuzzled her gently, making soft, guttural sounds. Not cries, not calls. Comfort. Frank dropped to his knees. He didn't expect breath. But then, a flicker of steam. A faint warmth on his palm. "She's alive," he whispered. Awe and urgency colliding. Star had done the impossible, kept her alive with body heat instincts and sheer will. Frank scooped the baby into his arms. She was feather-light and terrifyingly still. Star stood inches away, watching every move, not threatening, assessing. Frank paused, held the foal close. "She's okay," he whispered. "I've got her." Star nickered softly, permission granted. As they trudged back to the cabin, Frank clutching the baby inside his coat, Star stumbling beside him, a strange realization hit. They hadn't come here by accident. They had come for help, and they'd placed their survival, and the life of their youngest, into the hands of a man who thought his days of saving anything were long behind him. But Frank wasn't the only one watching that night. Back in the shadows of the trees, something else moved, something human, and it had followed the tracks just like he had. Frank stepped into the cabin, snow swirling behind him, baby foal pressed tight against his chest. The heat from the fire hit like a wave. But Hope, the name had come to him without thinking, was still ice cold. Star followed close, trembling, soaked, but focused entirely on her foal. Her body leaned into Frank as he laid the baby gently on a pile of thick blankets near the fire. Hope wasn't moving. Frank's training kicked in again. This was no longer just a wild animal in trouble. This was a patient in critical condition. He grabbed water bottles, filled them with hot water, and tucked them around the tiny filly. He wrapped her in thermal blankets, moved slowly, monitored her breath. It was there, shallow, irregular, but there. Star lay down beside her, curling protectively. She made a low, rhythmic sound. It wasn't panic, it wasn't fear, it was will, determination. Frank recognized it instantly. "I've heard that sound in field hospitals," he murmured, adjusting the blankets. "It's the sound a mother makes when she's not ready to say goodbye." Outside, the storm roared. Inside, the cabin became a place suspended in time. A sanctuary where death hovered in the corners, waiting for a reason to stay or go. Hours passed. Frank didn't sleep. He rotated hot water, checked vitals, spoke gently. At one point, he placed 2 fingers under Hope's chin and felt the faintest flutter of breath. "Come on, little one," he whispered. "Your mama didn't drag you through hell just to watch you slip away now." And then, a twitch. It was so slight he thought he imagined it. Then Hope's ear flicked. Then a soft exhale, a flutter of the eyelids. Frank leaned in, eyes stinging. The baby opened her eyes, and Star, who had not moved in hours, made a sound so full of joy, so soft and deep and human in its feeling, that Frank had to turn away. The pain behind his eyes came flooding forward, uninvited and unstoppable. He hadn't cried since Afghanistan. Not when friends were lost. Not when he buried his parents. Not even when he'd come home to silence and walls he couldn't explain. But watching that little filly blink into life, and her mother lower her head to gently nuzzle her, he felt something crack inside. Hope was alive. And somehow, so was he. He stepped outside to breathe, to clear his head, and that's when he heard it. Engines, far off, but getting closer. At first, he thought it might be search and rescue. Maybe someone had seen the trailer or tracked the storm. But no, something felt wrong. Too many engines, moving too deliberately, no sirens, no lights. Then Star stirred inside, ears alert, body stiff. Storm and Bronze rose beside her, flanking Hope, forming a protective wall. Frank had seen that posture before, in patrol dogs in Kandahar, in wild animals cornered by predators. They recognized the sound, and they were afraid. He moved to the window, peering into the blizzard. Headlights, 2 trucks, large, with trailers. The kind you use when you're not asking permission. Then, a knock, hard, sharp. The kind meant to dominate. Frank positioned himself between the door and the horses. His rifle was within reach, but not visible. He opened the door just enough to show his face. A man stood there, heavy-set, scar on his cheek, tactical jacket not uniform. 3 others behind him, flanking the porch. "We're with Montana Fish and Wildlife." The man growled. "Hear about a horse trailer accident. Need to inspect the animals." Frank said nothing for a moment. Let the wind do the talking. Then he replied, evenly, "You got ID?" No one moved. The scarred man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We don't have time for games, old man. Hand over the horses, and no one gets hurt." Behind Frank, Star let out a low, rumbling sound. It wasn't fear this time. It was something older, deeper, wiser. Frank's hand slid toward his rifle. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He wasn't looking for a fight, but this was his herd now. And some lines. "You don't cross." Frank stood in the doorway, rifle within reach. Heart steady, the snow howled around them. But inside the cabin, time had gone still. Star shifted behind him, standing protectively over Hope. Bronze and Storm flanked her, alert and unmoving. The instinct in that room was ancient. A herd standing together. The men on the porch didn't flinch. These weren't officers. Frank had seen enough fake uniforms and phony authority in war zones to spot the difference. Their coats were too clean, their boots too quiet, and their eyes too cold. "You tracked them here," Frank said quietly. 3 mares and a foal. That trailer out there, it was yours, wasn't it? The scarred man smirked. "Hand them over, Marine. They're worth more than your pension." Frank didn't blink. "And what happens if I say no?" "You don't want to find out." But Frank already knew. He'd seen this game played out in burned villages and shattered towns. This was greed wrapped in muscle. People who didn't see animals, only dollar signs. He opened the door just a little wider. "Let them see the rifle. They came to me for help," he said. "And I'm not in the habit of turning away those who can't protect themselves." One of the men stepped forward, hand drifting toward his jacket. Frank moved faster. The first shot cracked through the night. Not a kill shot, but close. The man screamed, dropping to the snow, clutching his shoulder. The others backed up. Frank stepped fully into the doorway, silhouette framed in firelight. Next one won't be a warning. They hesitated, just long enough to weigh their options. Then they grabbed their wounded partner, piled into the trucks, and disappeared into the storm. But Frank knew it wasn't over. By morning, the storm had broken. The mountains were wrapped in a quiet white blanket, but peace didn't come with the sunrise. Frank called for help. Real help, this time. A veterinarian from town, Dr. Sarah Chen, arrived within hours. Mid-40s Sarah's, sharp-eyed, steady hands. The kind of woman who didn't flinch at emergencies. She stepped into the cabin, took one look at the horses, at the foal lying next to the fire, now alert and blinking, and turned to Frank. "What you did here, that's remarkable." Frank only nodded. He didn't feel like a hero. He just felt like someone who'd been in the right place at the right time, and finally for once hadn't walked away. Dr. Chen's examination confirmed what Frank already suspected: Hope would live. Her vitals were improving. She was underweight, dehydrated, but her will was strong, like her mother's, like the herd's. But the biggest surprise came when Dr. Chen followed Frank to the overturned trailer. There, in the broken wreckage, they found more than tracks. They found evidence, forged papers, smuggling logs, black market contacts. This wasn't just a crash. It was part of a nationwide operation. Illegal wild horse trafficking. Dr. Chen's face hardened. "We're calling the feds," and they came. Vast, by noon, helicopters circled overhead. Agents swarmed the trailer site, stunned by what they found. But the real shock came an hour later. Star began to call, not in panic, not in distress, a rhythmic, powerful sound that rolled through the hills. And then, they came. Dozens of them. Wild Mustangs, cresting the ridgeline like a tide of muscle and grace. Some bore scars, some limped. Survivors. Frank stood on his porch, stunned. Dr. Chen whispered. The whole herd, she brought them back. The traffickers returned too, this time in force. Trucks, ATVs, armed men. But what they met wasn't just a veteran with a rifle. They met a herd, 60 strong, surrounding the property, blocking exits, moving in unison. What followed was the most surreal takedown in Montana wildlife enforcement history. The Mustangs, led by Star and coordinated by instinct and rage, pinned vehicles, scattered men and corralled them until the FBI arrived. Star had done more than survive, she had remembered. 6 months later, Frank's cabin had a new name, the Morrison Sanctuary. The Department of the Interior hired him as a federal consultant. Dr. Chen became both his partner in the field, and eventually, in life. Bronze and Storm made full recoveries, and were reintroduced to the wild. But Star stayed. So did Hope. They chose Frank. And Frank. Let them. Where there had once been silence, now there were hoofbeats. Laughter. The soft whinny of a growing foal, and the steady presence of a mare, who had once led her kind through death to something like salvation. Frank sat on the porch most evenings now. Hope curled beside him, her head in his lap like a giant dog. He didn't dream of war anymore, and he didn't need solitude to feel at peace. Because in saving them, this unlikely herd, they had saved him right back.